Conscience, guilt and remorse are interrelated concepts that feature heavily in Macbeth. Conscience is a moral sense of right and wrong which guides our behaviour. Guilt is the acknowledgement that you have done something wrong. And remorse, after the acceptance of guilt, is the deep regret that you feel for having committed the wrong and the desire to make it right. Conscience and ideas of guilt and remorse permeate the play, even before the first murder has been committed. Macbeth wrestles with his conscience before he resolves to kill Duncan. He knows that it would be morally wrong for a number of reasons. He's here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject, strong both against the deed. Then, as his host, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. He firstly reasons that he is Duncan's relation as well as his subject, and that he is also his host, someone who should strive to protect his guest against harm, rather than bring it on him himself. He then goes on to muse on Duncan's conduct as a king. Besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. He knows that Duncan has exercised his royal powers extremely modestly, and as a king has been faultless and honourable. He suggests that the unjust nature of this regicide, and therefore his guilt in the perpetration of the act, will be an affront to heaven. He goes on to acknowledge that he has no reason for killing him other than his ambition. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other. He is well aware that his ambition is not an adequate excuse, but it is the only reason that he has. He recognises the danger in this, likening his excessive ambition to a horse which jumps too high and falls on the other side of the fence. In contrast, Lady Macbeth does not wrestle with her conscience before the murder in the same way that her husband does. She chooses instead to focus on preventing any guilt or remorse she may feel that could stop her going through with it. She commands the spirits to make thick my blood, stop up the access and passage to remorse, that no compunctious visitings of nature shake my fell purpose, nor keep peace between the effect and it. Compunctious means characterised by guilt or moral scruple that either prevents us from doing something bad or follows the doing of something bad. The fact that she links this with nature suggests that she is aware that remorse is a natural emotion and that what she is asking for is totally unnatural. Whether the mortal spirits oblige her up to a point, or Lady Macbeth just fools herself that she is impervious to guilt and remorse, is up for discussion. As Macbeth creeps towards Duncan's bedchamber, dagger in hand, he has an hallucination of another dagger which seems to appear in the air in front of him. Is this another supernatural visitation, or is it more likely to be a manifestation of the guilt he is feeling in anticipation of committing the act? Even he is not sure which is which, as he vacillates between believing what his eyes are telling him and discounting it as illogical and more likely to be a false creation proceeding from the heat-oppressed brain. If supernatural, we would expect it to be enticing him to commit the murder, but if we look closely at Macbeth's language, we can see that it is not, in fact, leading him towards Duncan at all. Thou marshallest me the way that I was going, and such an instrument I was to use. Although the verb marshal means to direct the movement of something or someone, the fact that Macbeth says the way that I was going suggests that it is not leading the way, but only showing him what he had decided to do anyway. And it also looks like the dagger that he already has in his hand that he was to use. Macbeth's language is interesting here, especially if we compare it with Lady Macbeth's own language later, after the appearance of Banquo's ghost. Macbeth has clearly already told her of the apparition, but as she mocks him, she says, "Oh, proper stuff! This is the very painting of your fear. This is the air-drawn dagger which you said led you to Duncan. It would appear that Macbeth has subtly revised his memory of that night to imply that he was in the thrall of some supernatural power, as he perhaps seeks to distance himself from his sense of guilt. The fact that the dagger also has on its blade and dudgeon gouts of blood is suggestive of it being an hallucination caused by guilt. Again, if supernatural, the fact that it appears as a gruesome sight covered with blood before the actual committing of the crime does not downplay its consequences and could hardly be expected to entice Macbeth to go ahead. The fact that blood is a motif in the play, symbolic of guilt, suggests that this apparition is more likely to be a symptom of his sense of this than anything conjured by the witches. The murder takes place off stage and Macbeth re-enters in Act 2, Scene 2, the deed done. This scene is all about guilt and remorse, be it expressing it, dismissing it, or disguising it. In the immediate aftermath of Duncan's killing, Macbeth is racked with guilt to the extent that he goes completely to pieces. The brave Macbeth of Act 1, who unseamed the traitorous MacDonald from the nave to the chaps, and cut off his head to fix on the battlements, has vanished, as the act of murdering an innocent sleeping king has shaken him to the core. He seems almost seized by the inability to act, as bringing the bloody daggers out of the chamber with him in his bloody hands instead of leaving them there, he declares, "This is a sorry sight." He is stricken by the fact that he was unable to pronounce Amen in response to the drunken guard's God bless you, professing that "I had most need of blessing and Amen stuck in my throat." This inability to utter a word inextricably linked with prayer immediately after having committed an act of regicide is symptomatic of the act being considered an affront to heaven, not only in the eyes of King James I, but also of the audience. Macbeth starts hearing things. "Methought I heard a voice cry, 'Sleep no more, Macbeth doth murder sleep.'" This is prescient, as there are extensive references to insomnia throughout the rest of the play, and neither of the Macbeths are able to sleep properly from the murder of Duncan up to their deaths. He elaborates that it is the innocent sleep, the sleep that knits up the ravelled sleeve of care, or sleep that is restorative and refreshing for those who do not have a guilty conscience, that is no longer to be his. The use of the adjective innocent here suggests the guilt he is feeling. In contrast to her stupefied husband, the practical Lady Macbeth bustles about, tying up loose ends and attempting to shake him out of his apathy, apparently impervious to any feelings of guilt. "Why, worthy Thane, you do unbend your noble strength to think so brain-sickly of things. Go get some water and wash this filthy witness from your hand." He refuses to return to the chamber with the knives, though, not wishing to come face to face with his guilt. "I'll go no more. I am afraid to think what I have done. Look on it again I dare not." She scolds him, infirm of purpose, before going to place the knives herself. As well as enhancing the characterisation of the pair, Lady Macbeth's entry into the bedchamber to place the bloody daggers also has a dramatic function for Shakespeare. Not only does Lady Macbeth need to come face to face with the crime embodied in Duncan's bloody remains, but she also needs to play a material part in it. She has so far been just the brains behind the scheme, but by incriminating the innocent guard, she gets blood, both literal and metaphorical, on her hands. Meanwhile, Macbeth is in a complete state. His senses have become heightened and he is paranoid, jumping at every sound. The knocking at the gate startles him and he exclaims, "How is't with me when every noise appalls me?" He is also transfixed by his bloody hands which pluck out mine eyes. This sight and the guilt to which they testify is so shocking that it engenders in him a very visceral response. He feels as though his eyes are being wrenched out of their sockets. His hands are so covered in blood that he feels that rather than all of the oceans being able to clean it from them, there is enough blood on them to turn the green seas red. Will all Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Note the way in which the exaggerated amount of blood on his hand that he perceives has for him at least become metaphorical, symbolising his guilt, while for Lady Macbeth blood is literally that, blood which can be easily washed off. A little water clears us of this deed. How easy is it then? At this point, guilt for her is purely physical and superficial at that, and nothing to do with the emotions or the soul. Note the juxtaposition of blood with water and guilt with purity in these images. The contrast between Macbeth's multitudinous seas and Lady Macbeth's a little water demonstrates the extent to which they no longer see eye to eye. The scene ends with Macbeth still consumed by remorse. To know my deed 'twere best not to know myself. Wake Duncan with thy knocking. I would thou could. Note the way in which the iambic pentameter di-dum, 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 di-dum is disrupted here, reflecting Macbeth's state of turmoil, with two hypercatalectic lines of 11 syllables, where there is a substitution of an anapaest, di-di-dum, for the usual I am in the fourth foot of the first line. The second line is even more disjointed up to the caesura, with a spondy, dum-dum, a pyrrhus, diddy, and an amphibrach, didumdi. The aftermath of Duncan's murder and the Macbeths' emotional disconnect caused by their different experiences of guilt tear them apart. Macbeth starts to make decisions by himself and cuts Lady Macbeth out, starting with the murder of Banquos, ostensibly so that she remains innocent of the knowledge, dearest Chuck, until thou applaud the deed. After the murder, Macbeth once more suffers an hallucination, this time of Banquo's ghost. Once more we ask ourselves if this is supernatural or just another manifestation of his guilt. We discover that the vision of Banquo is covered in blood, symbolic of guilt, as Macbeth shouts at it, "Thou canst not say I did it, never shake thy gory locks at me." He tries to deny his guilt, ostensibly to the ghost, but really it is to himself. Technically, of course, Macbeth hasn't done it, although he is morally responsible for having commanded it. Later in the scene, he reflects on the difference between killings perpetrated in the past, presumably including those committed by him, and the murder of Banquo. The time has been that when the brains were out, the man would die, and there an end. But now they rise again with 20 mortal murders on their crowns and push us from our stools. Macbeth has only committed just murders in the past, in the service of his king and country, and he has never been troubled by those. This is a new experience for him. The Macbeths begin to undergo a role reversal. Macbeth initially feels guilt and remorse in the immediate aftermath of the murder, while Lady Macbeth keeps her cool. He comes to the realisation, however, that his guilt is such that he cannot stop. He is so steeped in blood, and therefore guilt, that he couldn't go back to his former self even if he wanted to, and consideration of his conscience is no longer enough to restrain his basest urges. I am in blood stepped in so far that should I wade no more, returning were as tedious as go o'er. At the same time, during this scene, we notice that Lady Macbeth's speeches get noticeably shorter as her influence upon her husband wanes, and this is the last time that she will appear until Act 5, Scene 1. During the course of Act 4, Macbeth, left to his own devices, gives himself up totally to a futile attempt to preserve his life and his position. He promises himself that he will no longer procrastinate and wrestle with his conscience as the very firstlings of my heart shall be the firstlings of my hand. As soon as he feels he should do something, he'll go ahead and do it, and so orders the deaths of the innocent Lady Macduff and her children without so much as batting an eyelid. The castle of Macduff I will surprise, seize upon Fife, give to the edge of the sword his wife, his babes, and all unfortunate souls that trace him in his line. What he hopes to achieve by this, though, is uncertain. Lady Macbeth's transition from feeling no guilt to being so ridden by it that it turns her mad happens off stage. She succumbs to her guilt in the end, becoming a shadow of her former self. Note that her very last words to Macbeth at the end of Act 3 refer to sleep. You lack the season of all natures, sleep. When she returns in Act 5, Scene 1, her gentlewoman reports to the doctor that she has been sleepwalking and talking in her sleep. Sleep has brought her no peace, and they spy her attempting to wash non-existent blood from her hands. Yet here's a spot. Her speech is no longer verse, but is now prose, indicating the extent to which she has fallen. Her speech is also littered with disjointed non sequiturs, showing the incoherence of her thoughts. Out, damned spot, out, I say. 1, 2, why then 'tis time to do it. Hell is murky. Fie, my lord, fie, a soldier and afeard. To the audience, of course, her ravings make sense. She is reliving the moment of the murder of Duncan and its aftermath. From the 2 rings of the bell signalling that the time is right, to her chiding of her husband for his perceived fear. The way in which she proclaims, "What need we fear who knows it, when none can call our power to account?" suggests that immediately after the murder she felt that guilt was not something which applied to them, because they were in an unassailable position as king and queen. Her tone quickly changes, however, when she asks, "Yet who would have thought the old man to have had such blood in him?" She seems surprised, as though there was more blood than you would expect. Blood being symbolic of guilt suggests that this has become overwhelming for her. This is not, however, the first time that the amount of blood is exaggerated. If you remember, Macbeth, when he was racked with guilt, feared that the blood on his hands would turn all the oceans red. How the positions have reversed as she obsesses over the blood that she cannot wash from her own hands. Here's the smell of blood still. All the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. As she exits, the doctor accurately diagnoses that what ails her is guilt, and that he can do nothing for her. Unnatural deeds do breed unnatural troubles. Infected minds their deaf pillows will discharge their secrets. More needs she the divine than the physician. Her mind is infected, not her body, and this leads to her talking in her sleep. What she needs now, he says, is not a doctor, but a priest. Macbeth is now so deluded that his attitude toward their guilt is such that he believes it to be not so much an affront to God and the natural order any more, but a disease that has a physical foundation and that is curable. He asks the doctor, "Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased, pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain, and with some sweet oblivious antidote cleanse the stuffed bosom of that perilous stuff which weighs upon the heart?" The doctor dismisses this request with a simple, "Therein the patient must minister to himself," presumably through seeking God's forgiveness, as implied by his reference to the divine in Act 5, Scene 1. Macbeth's rejection of God is therefore implied when he retorts, "Throw physic to the dogs, I'll none of it." Macbeth is irretrievably lost. Guilt is shown as a destabilising force in the play, and the guilt of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth for the unlawful killing of a king is more reflective of the Elizabethan worldview than that of 11th century Scotland. Following the Protestant Reformation in England during the 16th century, the divine right of kings gave the monarch absolute authority as God's representative on earth. And James I set out his own philosophy of kingship in his 1598 work, The True Law of Free Monarchies. In it, he asserted that kings owe their kingship to the will of God. Regicide is, therefore, an aberration of the natural order, and anyone who acts directly against a king acts directly against God. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's guilt, therefore, has wide ramifications, and this is reflected in the macrocosm in the way that nature is turned upside down on the night of Duncan's murder. Lennox declares that the night has been unruly. Where we lay, our chimneys were blown down, and, as they say, lamentings heard i' the air, strange screams of death, and prophesying with accents terrible of dire combustion and confused events, new hatched the woeful time. The obscure bird clamoured the livelong night. Some say the earth was feverous and did shake. Macbeth appeared in 1606, only a year after the Gunpowder Plot, which saw a failed assassination attempt on James I by English Catholics against the Protestant king. The king would have clearly appreciated the message that regicide was an affront to God and nature that Shakespeare was communicating here. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more videos on English language topics and exam techniques and English literature texts.